Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third program of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan's 2023 8-week Great Decision Series with topics suggested by the Foreign Policy Association. I'm Michael Vendetta, and I am the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council. On behalf of my colleagues, Erica Kubik and Rachel Brooks, and the Board of Directors of the World Affairs Council, we welcome you here tonight. Thank you for being with us, both in person and online. We're pleased to host the Great Decision Series here on Grand Rapids Community College's campus, and we are grateful to GRCC President Chuck Lepper and to our faculty liaison, Mike DeVivo, to our video producer, Klaus Quant, and his team, and campus colleagues for being such gracious hosts and for their support. It's the Council's mission to empower the people and organizations of West Michigan to engage thoughtfully with the world. We do that with the help of nearly 50 local businesses, 11 colleges and universities, and many, many individuals here in our community. Together, we seek to provide programming that is credible, objective, relevant, civil, and compelling. To change the world, we believe, you first need to know the world. And you can learn more about what we do at worldmichigan.org. Before we begin, we say thank you to Wolverine Worldwide for being our series sponsor. The WGVU Public Media is our presenting media sponsor. The Community Media Center is communications partner. And again, to Grand Rapids Community College as tonight's topic sponsor. We're honored to host Dr. Brittany Cook, a professor at Louisiana State University, who specializes in the study of global hunger and global food production. And we are thankful to you, Dr. Cook, for being here with us tonight. After her presentation, there will be ample time for questions. For those of you in the auditorium, there will be a microphone to pass. For those watching on the Council YouTube channel, you may type your questions into the chat box, and it will be forwarded here. For those both in person and online, you may also text your question to 616-308-6560. And please exhibit civility to our guests and hospitality to others in the audience by asking respectful and succinct questions. And now, Dr. Charles Lepper, who's the president of Grand Rapids Community College, will introduce our speaker this evening.
Thank you, Michael. Grand Rapids Community College is so proud to be associated with the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan and home of the 2023 Great Decision Series. How many of you, this is your first time to our campus? Well, a special welcome to you. Please come back and see us often. But let me tell you a little bit about GRCC, as I know it in my 6 weeks of being here. So GRCC offers learners of all ages opportunities, and that's something that we're very proud of, to gain credits for degrees that transfer or for in-demand careers and skills that lead them to rewarding careers. And like the council, we understand that global awareness is essential to success and making West Michigan a more welcoming environment to live and work. GRCC educates students to be citizens of the world and equips them to thrive in the international marketplace. So we invite all of you back to visit us throughout the year and to catch our vibrancy. It is my honor tonight to introduce our speaker, Dr. Brittany Cook, which was mentioned as an assistant professor in the Department of Geography and Anthropology at Louisiana State University. She earned her bachelor's degree from Mary Washington University, her master's degree from the University of South Carolina, and her PhD from the University of Kentucky. Dr. Cook's research examines the role of international politics and economics in rural development in Jordan. She has previously studied organic olive oil production and women's food cooperative and businesses. She is currently interested in the connections between global geopolitics and the changes in wheat production and questions around seeds, water, and climate change. Her broader interests include feminist theory and methodologies, political geography, political ecology, and Middle East studies. Her presentation tonight is titled The Geopolitics of Global Hunger and Global Food Production. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Brittany Cook.
technology is all set up and working. Okay, can you hear me? Sound good? All right, perfect. No? Let's see. There we go. All right, how's that? All right. If anything happens with the mic, please just wave at me, throw things, whatever you need to do. Okay, so first of all, a gigantic thank you to Mike DeVivo at GRCC and the World Affairs Council for inviting me today as a speaker as part of this series. I have to be honest, when I looked at the list of previous and speakers to come, I was quite intimidated. It's the type of people that I interview in my work, right? The people I see as experts. But then I started thinking about, as a feminist political geographer, how can I contribute to this conversation? I mean, full disclosure, my work I don't think of my work as directly about famine and hunger. I'm more interested in kind of rural development practices globally and the local effects they have in Jordan. But then I started to think about how famine is exactly the type of issue that Svalbard Global Seed Vault, which is one thing I'm interested in looking at right now, and seed banks more generally, famine is exactly one of the things they're trying to address, right? Anticipating future famines. And it made me think, how do famine fears and the related ideas of food security shape global food systems and in turn rural livelihoods and what rural development looks like? Today, I'll show how neo-Malthusian and environmentally deterministic famine fear logics have had long-term impacts on global food systems. Furthermore, these logics around famine, combined with the global system of racial capitalism, can create blinders to facilitating food sovereignty, which is the ability for people to actually control what their food system looks like. And don't worry, it's a lot of jargon. We'll pick those apart as we go along. And I want to have this conversation through two different sort of case studies, one being the Svalbard Global Seed Vault and my work of olive oil production in Jordan. And while these two projects seem worlds apart, what I want to show is that they do share an overlapping history of agricultural geopolitics and underlying logics about productivity. And I think racial capitalism is a great way to kind of pick that apart and go into greater detail. So although famines are now, in our current era, far less common and less severe than they were in the past, hunger and food security are still global concerns. And we know this if you look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, zero hunger is one of the main goals, and there's still a long way to go. And all the challenges we've faced in the past few years between COVID and its supply chain issues, inflation, the Ukraine-Russia war, and climate change, of course, this has people questioning again in real fear about, do we have enough food to feed the world? These food scarcity anxieties about our current food system and future famine are flooding the headlines. I mean, you can just Google it, and so many of the conversations are about how can we adapt and feed everybody in this current flux and food stress that we're facing. While recent events and the ongoing ramifications of climate change have real concerning impacts on food systems, I don't want to give you the impression that I'm belittling the challenges that these events present for food systems, but these anxieties about running out of food and widespread famine are often rooted in simplistic Malthusian logic. And so Malthusian logic refers to the idea that population can grow exponentially, but food growth is limited. He wrote that if we produce more food, population will expand until it can no longer be sustained, then there'll be mass famine, lots of death, and then so the cycle will continue. Population decreases, produce food until you can't support the population. However, this calculation does not account for technological advancement that he, of course, in his time could not foresee, infrastructural improvements, and also consumption patterns and trade and the way our food system works today. But today, the term neo-Malthusian refers to theories based on the belief that population is one of the biggest threats to the future of human life and the planet itself. While the critiques of this framework are well established in the academic literature, The idea is still living. It still drives many of the headlines and policies we see today. And I'll talk about a scholar in a moment, Alex DeWall, who calls it the Malthusian zombie, like this thing that just keeps coming back in unanticipated ways. So while being concerned about food insecurity and hunger is important, the danger comes when food production is thought about in simple terms of how many tons of food or X number of calories are needed to feed X number of people. In other words, it focuses on food availability. And there's so many different ways in which we can think about our food systems and who has access to food. So Amartya Sen is one of the foremost scholars responsible for kind of making this distinction between food availability and food access. So food availability would be that equation I just mentioned. How many calories do we produce on the national level often according to our population, right? Is there enough food available for folks? And his argument was food access is wildly different than that formula, right? That it's actually looking at how people can access the food. And he's saying that makes the difference. That's what we need to be looking at to really understand our food systems and if we're doing a good job of feeding our populations. And these terms can be used they get interchanged sometimes. So if you're like, that's not how I've heard it used, that's part of the problem is these don't have clear definition or clear delineations in colloquial usage. Food security often refers to does the country have enough nutritious food for its population? So it's similar. It accounts for food access and looking at different types of food in some contexts. But then self-sufficiency is how much food is being produced in that place. And I think COVID and the supply chain issues that we've been facing with Ukraine-Russia war, a lot of places have been focusing on food security in the past and are starting to ask more questions about food self-sufficiency, right? Because of all the price fluctuations on the global market and supply chain issues. And then more recently, people have been talking about food sovereignty, right? To have the people who are consuming the food have control over how they get that food, where it's coming from, how it's produced. And so the framing around availability does not account for food accessibility on a community level, nor does it account for food sovereignty a lot of times, which, like I explains whether people have control over their own food systems. Although famine has historically been decreasing in occurrence, climate change has renewed fears about widespread famine in our future. And famine, by definition, according to the WFP, is 30% of children suffering from malnutrition, 20% of households being food insecure, and 2 out of 10,000 people dying from starvation per day. And then other agencies and colloquial usages define famine based on food consumption, food supply, and/or mortality rates. While identifying when famine is happening by these metrics I just mentioned is fairly straightforward, right? You can access those statistics. Identifying the causes and best solutions to famine is a larger topic of debate. And so Alex DeWall is one of the foremost scholars on famine. In his book, Mass Starvation, he identifies climate change in transactional politics, including the use of humanitarian action for political gain, as the 2 largest forces that will shape whether or not we have future famines. Although he identifies climate change as a major factor, he argues that we have moved from drought famines of the past, right, to political famines of the present moment. And he claims that even climate scientists and others who are saying, climate change will create new famines, and that's the cause of a lot of our current examples of famine today, he urges them to dial back this, he calls them kind of neo-Malthusian ideas about climate change causing famine. And hold on, if you're following, yes, you heard me right. At the same time, he is saying that climate change is one of the factors shaping famine in our current era, but at the same time, we have to be careful about how we frame it as a cause of famine. He's saying that's a factor, but then when it's seen as the main driver, it creates an environmentally deterministic narrative that undermines an examination of the human causes of famine. Right? He's saying at the end of the day, in our current era, if famine is happening in a country, it's a political economic issue, right? It's something with the supply chain. It's something with policy that's going on. Climate change is exacerbating those things, but at the end of the day, it's a political problem in our modern age. Despite DeWall's work, fears about climate-induced famine proliferate both popular media and academic literature. These famine fears regarding the dual threat of population growth and climate change that undergird not only the headlines about our food systems, but also what agricultural initiatives are invested in. My goal here, again, is not to mark a particular initiative as bad. I don't think that they are. But I want to call attention to how fear-based famine logics, which I'll refer to as famine logics or famine fears, drive investments in particular agricultural initiatives and policies over other potential solutions. So like I said, kind of putting on blinders to what we need to prioritize. And so first I'll talk about Svalbard Global Seed Vault, and then I will put this in conversation to the local context in Jordan by discussing my work on olive oil production. So first, what is Svalbard? Svalbard Global Seed Vault was started in 2008 with support from the Norwegian Ministry of Agriculture and Food, Nordgen, which is the Nordic country's seed bank or gene bank, and the Crop Trust, which was created by the FAO and CGIAR, which is a kind of network of gene banks across the world. The Seed Vault functions as a global depository for gene banks across the world. The sharing of the plant material is governed by the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, signed by 149 countries around the world. And the treaty has room for creating agreements on how to protect farmers' interests and also how to share genetic plant material. But studies have shown that there's been a lot more work on this genetic plant material and less on how it can be implemented to support farmers, which makes sense. Farmers is a much more amorphous category than a clear-cut network of gene banks. Svalbard Seed Vault has over 1 million accessions of 5,968 different species from 93 gene banks. And these statistics are changing as more gene banks deposit their materials. Only the depositor can withdraw the plant material, and the only gene bank to withdraw so far is Acarda, which is a gene bank formerly based in Syria. And they withdrew their deposits into the vault to recreate their research centers in Lebanon due to the Syrian conflict. And so this got a good bit of press in recent years. But we can also look at the Seed Vault as a representation of mankind's fight against future famine, right? This futuristic cement mass emerging from the snowy surroundings, not accessed by many, a contrast between being a global depository and being in the world's northernmost inhabited area. If you look at the headlines, the nickname Doomsday Vault is often used. The popular media loves to discuss this Doomsday Vault as our Hail Mary in a post-apocalyptic future after climate change has rendered our current agricultural practices and food systems untenable. Right? The Noah's Ark of agriculture, if you will, the ultimate insurance plan against worldwide famine. Carrie Fowler, who was the former executive director of the Crop Diversity Trust and a strategic player in the founding of the Vault, tries to distance himself from this portrayal in the popular media in a book that he published called Seeds on Ice, which has beautiful photography of Svalbard Seed Vault. So if you're interested in looking at that, it's a great read. And he emphasizes that the real goal of the Vault is global cooperation in the name of science and biodiversity preservation for multiple uses, right? Not just this doomsday kind of idea. However, in the book, he's still talking about these underlying logics related to global agriculture and hunger. And so today I want to use the Seed Vault to ground a discussion of how famine logics or famine fears and these ideas of we must produce more food to feed the world continue to shape rural development today in ways that I argue create blinders about what type of rural futures are desirable. And these blinders are hard to notice, but I think a discussion of racial capitalism and a historical tracing of these logics can help us question what types of rural development drive our food system and who benefits. But how did I get interested in the Seed Vault, right? I do organic agricultural research in Jordan. But I was interested in this because I noticed they had I'm now interested in seed bank development and seed saving practices. And so this kind of takes the headlines as the global depository, as I mentioned, and you can download the database for free online. All of you can go home. I know this is what you want to do on a weekend, but you can download all of the data and look at all the different species that are in the, I'm afraid to press buttons. Oh, there we go. Okay, yes, all of the species that are deposited by each gene bank, the country of origin of all of the seed samples, and it's really amazing fodder for a data nerd. And so I downloaded this data, and when I began to look through, I was kind of interested in, okay, who owns seeds from where? As a geographer, I was interested in those kind of geographic spatial connections. But when I started mapping it and the sheer volume of entries, it was hard to determine clear trends. This is where, if anyone is a statistics whiz and you're interested in this, maybe we can collaborate on that. But spatially, the trends weren't as clear. When I compare the National Plant Germplasm System, which is US-based, to ICARDA, which was formerly Syria-based, now Lebanon-based, you notice that both of them hold a multitude of seeds from different countries, right? They both, a large majority of their seeds are from the regions that they serve. So United States, 17.82%. Although ICARDA technically has more that are owned from the ICARDA region, because then you also have Syria, Jordan, Turkey that are in the ICARDA region. So, but in general, they both contain species from all over the world. But when you start looking at the species, that's where it gets interesting. I think that's what shapes the countries is, okay, the National Germplasm System is interested in crops that are of interest to the US. So wheat and soy, and also barley. Whereas ICARDA, which is in Southwest Asia, right, Syria, more arid agriculture, is more interested in, or has more samples from barley and 2 different types of bread wheat. And almost all of these, or the major gene banks, or actually 50% of all depositors have wheat, corn, and barley, right? So wheat is in 50% of all gene banks, corn is, and barley is. But if we dig into the history of many of the largest gene banks and their crops, these archives are not only archives of genetic material, but they're also a direct material archive of the Green Revolution and particular reviews about agricultural development. And so I wanted to give a little bit of a background about the Green Revolution. To this day, scholars and practitioners recall 2 very different narratives of what the Green Revolution accomplished or didn't. There's a deep literature on the topic, but the summary is this. The Green Revolution refers to an international effort to breed higher yield varieties of strategic crops such as corn and wheat. Strategic both in terms of feeding people and in terms of US commodities. The story is often told around this fellow, Norman Borlaug, who worked for the Rockefeller Foundation and later the newly established CIMMYT, which is now a gene bank in Mexico, to help develop wheat varieties in Mexico between 1944 and 1979. But this didn't just take place between the US and Mexico. This was a global effort. He went to Pakistan and maybe more famously went to India. And he had to try multiple times. He went to India in the early 60s to try to advocate for his improved wheat varieties to create more wheat yield in India to feed more people, and people were resistant. They're like, this, you're asking us to irrigate, you're asking us to put fertilizers, this isn't how we traditionally do wheat production, not interested. And then India started to receive food aid in the form of wheat from the United States. And then the United States threatened to not give them that wheat if India didn't follow certain political policies that the US wanted. So then with that kind of insecurity of the imported wheat, they finally embraced a project to spread wheat yields around, or spread these improved seeds around India to increase yields. And so today, proponents, people who support the Green Revolution, emphasize how the breeding of high-yield varieties expanded production of important grains, grain crops such as corn and wheat across the world, unlocking food potential and alleviating food shortages for generations. Critics of the Green Revolution say that the statistics around production do not actually show that increased yields saved countries from famine, in part because while more food was produced, right, that's our food accessibility or availability, sorry, it didn't necessarily change anything about how accessible the food is to individual people, so not looking at food access. Furthermore, in some places, the new crops and yields changed diverse consumption practices and made people more reliant on these particular varieties of wheat, for example, instead of supplying food for the existing more diverse consumption patterns. And then other studies also argue that the long-term environmental effects of these high-yield varieties and the required water and fertilizers indebted farmers and negatively impacted the environment. So, and I'm not here to say which is right. I think they both kind of point to realities of what the Green Revolution did. But that is to say that this is part of the history of Svalbard, right? This very contentious and political and hugely changed the entire global food system is part of the history of Svalbard. And so Fowler, in his book, it was interesting that he's really emphasizing the vault's neutrality. And he's trying to emphasize how it's this example of global cooperation. And he's also saying that biodiversity is so important for, in light of climate change challenges that we're facing as one of the largest threats to global food supply and human civilization. So although he's kind of saying, it's not a doomsday vault, but still it's going to save human civilization. So he's kind of balancing between the two. And he also makes sure to address the critics of the project by saying that the vault is politically neutral and is not the only way to conserve biodiversity, and only seeds lose when proponents of one conservation effort denigrate another, which is a good point. The book emphasizes the global cooperation that it took to create such a global depository and the importance of this collection for securing biodiversity for genetic research. He also calls out directly China, Ethiopia, India, Iran, Japan, and Mexico for not contributing their national gene bank materials to the vault. He's like, there's no cost. You retain ownership. Why not? Which is interesting then, because you think about those CGIAR gene banks that are part of this Green Revolution history and kind of international funding from Rockefeller Foundation, well, international, but US-based, right? Rockefeller Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and how they are donating to Svalbard, but some national governments in the same country were hesitant to actually donate their national material. So that's something I want to look into and see if I can kind of get in the history of that. But so although he emphasizes the neutrality of the seed vault and his point about conservation efforts don't need to shoot down each other, it's good to have multiple strategies, are valid. I think it's important to pick a little bit at this claim of neutrality, right? Because as I outlined, the Green Revolution is not neutral. Again, the goal of collecting specimens in order to preserve biodiversity is not bad. However, we can still question how Svalbard fits into the larger global food systems and what other alternative strategies should also be supported. Who is seen as qualified? Who is doing this work that this network is creating? This is where racial capitalism, I think, can be a useful framework to examine the economic dynamics that famine logics conceal. So racial capitalism. Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism was recirculated in 2000 and is credited with the revival of interest in the theory of racial capitalism. He's not the first person to discuss it or theorize it, but he's kind of lauded as someone who has brought it to attention in academic circles again. Racial capitalism forces us to work from the premise that the world market system has a symbiotic relationship with racial differentiation. Robinson describes the relationship between capitalism and race by tracing how racial categories emerged in Europe alongside global capitalist systems, exaggerating existing regional, subcultural, and dialectical difference into racial ones. So saying, okay, you're Tartar, but instead of just having that be a regional difference about places, having that actually something that's racial, kind of embodied. And so he traces a history of how particular groups of people became listed as racially inferior and therefore prime for exploitation and domination. Scholars such as Bhattacharya have extended the analysis beyond race, as it is often thought about in the US context, to include other lines of difference, such as ability, sex, and gender, thinking of race as more broadly the mode of categorization that references the body, nature, an underlying and unchangeable essence that signals unpassable difference. And that's from this fantastic book that she has written. And she extends the idea of racial capitalism to other lines of difference, because these techniques of othering and exclusion utilize the logics of race that are inscribed on the body, regardless of the targeted population. She goes on to describe how this casts some people and regions as expendable, and that this is key to capitalist development, that some populations will never be included and will never reach viability of sustainability. And so if we view Svalbard from this perspective, then we're encouraged to interrogate how the seed material was collected and from whom, what seed materials are and are not valued, what seeds are used by their respective gene banks, and what this says about how this technology will be used and by whom in the future. What kind of future are they envisioning through this work? Bhattacharya briefly discusses Vandana Shiva's critiques of the Green Revolution in terms of racial capitalism as well in the book. And racial capitalism is certainly not the only framework that looks at these issues. But in contrast to theories of environmental justice, for example, racial capitalism is looking at not just the ramifications of capitalism, right, but at how racial difference is the logic of capitalism itself. So as the saying goes, right, the system isn't broken, it's working just as it's intended. Furthermore, a focus on racial capitalism emphasizes how different populations are seen as productive or not, highlighting aspects of racial capitalism beyond just environmental degradation. And so she brings in social reproduction and thinking about what is productive labor in her book more broadly. And so racial capitalism provides an explanation of why minority groups and those seen as not economically productive are the first to suffer from famine beyond political discrimination. And so there's a nice synergy between this work and Alex de Waal's book that I mentioned earlier. He doesn't talk about racial capitalism, but he talks about how often minority groups or groups with fewer resources are the ones to suffer famine in a country. And I think racial capitalism gives a good structural explanation and historical explanation of why that is. And it calls attention to how entire nations are cast as these unsustainable spaces, right, in particular ways, especially when we use the nation state as our default unit of analysis. I kind of see it as if Alex de Waal discussed climate change-induced famines as a Malthusian zombie, then racial capitalism is kind of a way to like call them out and try and stave off the zombie, right? Although these scholars don't use racial capitalism directly, Marwa Dawudi and Jeannie Sowers have called attention to how climate security discourses, so fears about climate change on a national level, fail to look at the political economic issues related to differential vulnerability on a community or individual scale. So there's a parallel here between de Waal's work on famine and what they're saying about climate. For example, studies that focus on the threat of climate migration focus on borders and ignore the ways in which individuals and communities are having to face borders and why, and how they're facing challenges of human sustenance, and how both those who leave and those who don't and can't are facing similar challenges. And so racial capitalism calls attention to how places and the people, such as in Southwest Asia, are cast as desolate and non-productive, shaping how development programs function and what policies should be implemented. This is compounded by additional racial dynamics, or as Robtel Nijay Paley calls it, the white gaze of development, which she describes as the gaze that assumes whiteness as the primary referent of power, prestige, and progress across the world. It equates whiteness with wholeness and superiority. and this is all quoted from her, the white gaze of development measures the political, socioeconomic, and cultural processes of Southern, Black, brown, and other people of color against a standard of Northern whiteness and finds them incomplete, wanting, inferior, or regressive. In essence, white is always right and West is always best. Development agencies are not neutral or colorblind. That's the whole point of this, is saying, okay, we need to kind of like questioning the Svalbard's neutrality, questioning development agencies' claims to be neutral, or even more so, being more diverse and doing DEI and saying, okay, but how are these ideas of race and this white gaze still permeating how this institution functions? And I saw this frequently in my work on olive oil, right, and capacity building in the industry in Jordan, when some Jordanians would talk about knowledge exchange with Spain or Greece, and they'd make comments about how uneven the level of knowledge is between there and Jordan. And even they would take up these discourses about the more northern institutions being more knowledgeable. Furthermore, others have used racial capitalism to critique the Rockefeller Foundation and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for the ways in which they reinforce these racial ideas of who has ownership over knowledge, and debates about whether private players should have such a large role in humanitarian agencies. So Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation are big contributors to the CGIAR, World Food Program, and so this calls attention to the impact they have in shaping national governments' agendas, international organizations, and their impacts on food systems, making us question what types of engagements and people they support. And it's important because of the gravity of the impacts they can have on food systems. And you can see this green revolution discussion is not over, although it was, the first green revolution was between the 40s and 70s. There's renewed interest in other parts of the world in using similar logics. And so for the rest of the talk, I want to think through these theories from West Asia and North Africa. As I've been reading through analyses of Ukraine-Russia's conflict, or the conflict's impact on food systems, Southwest Asia, or the Middle East, is almost always framed as food insecure due to climate change, and soil and water degradation. It is also discussed in terms of political instability due to conflicts and riots whenever food subsidies are threatened. However, I think a focus on racial capitalism would require us to look at how global ideas of social difference cast the region this way, and how this excuses things like food aid dumping and agricultural policies that encourage market engagement over other interests. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with Jordan, it's nestled here in the Levant region of Southwest Asia. My work specifically focused in the north, up here, because I was working primarily with olive producers. Kind of quick political history, people who live in this area have ties to Syria. This area was established as a British protectorate in 1921. And before that, part of this would have been part of the Ottoman region of Syria. And then Jordan became the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan in 1946. And since then, the Hashemite monarchy, who traces their lineage to Mecca and the Prophet Muhammad, tried to create a unified state across all this whole territory of Jordan, where people had previously had relationships to not each other, but places surrounding. And if I were to look at Jordan strictly under the premise of famine or hunger, Jordan is rated, it's rated low on the low side of moderate, in the global hunger index. You can see the arid landscape. It's often labeled as this arid landscape with very little potential for agriculture, limited arable land. And while this might make us assume that Jordan is not widely affected by global efforts to grow more food, right? Green Revolution was focused, obviously, in places where you could grow large amounts of food. If we take a closer look at the geopolitics at the time, it had direct impacts on local environments and food systems. And so if you look at this landscape, it's covered in olive orchards. But when I was doing research between 2015 and 2017, a lot of farmers were telling me that this area a lot of it was once wheat and other food crops. And the WFP, the World Food Program, has a statistic on their website that they are responsible for 70% of the trees planted alongside, with help from the Ministry of Agriculture in Jordan, 70% of the olive trees planted in the country between the 50s, I think, to the 2000s. When I asked farmers about what was the reason behind this transition, why did people abandon wheat, one of the main reasons people bring up is U.S. food aid, right, which was initiated through Public Law 480 or PL 480. And I want to discuss that briefly because it's tied intimately, and this is another picture of the landscape, it's tied intimately to this Green Revolution. They're going on around the same time. And the U.S. government implemented this way to discard of agricultural surplus through Public Law 480. Barrett and Maxwell outlined some of the debates that went into forming the policy in this book, Food Aid After 50 Years, Recasting Its Role. They describe how food aid was used to address several different needs beyond humanitarian assistance. Although food aid has been the U.S.'s largest kind of contribution to global, or they are the largest contributors of food aid to humanitarian efforts, the policy was also developed as a way to get rid of surplus and as a political bargaining tool, right, to build political relationships, as I kind of mentioned briefly when talking about India. It had 3 different titles, and it's changed over time. I think Kennedy is famous for shifting the program to be called Food for Peace, and instead of getting rid of surplus wheat, focusing on encouraging farmers to produce for the program. So still benefiting wheat producers in the U.S. and also building markets for U.S. wheat internationally. Experts contend that this multi-purpose mission, right, trying to do humanitarian aid, trying to do provide loans for other countries through currency, trying to create markets for wheat and get rid of surplus is too much, and that this multi-purpose mission makes it an inefficient form of aid because it leads to food aid being distributed according to these political and economic objectives rather than the largest humanitarian need. And I would argue that most humanitarian need from a government is going to have political objectives along with it, but this was very clearly written out as such. At the same time, Barrett and Maxwell caution us against simplifying food aid as causing the collapse of local wheat production in other countries. They say food aid undoubtedly put countries in a position in which their food system shifted to account for this aid, which then created a need for governments to play nice politically with the United States. Two case studies on bread production have come out recently, one in Egypt by Jessica Barnes, there we go, and the other in Jordan by Jose Ciro Martinez. And they both, although their focus is on the more recent history of bread production specifically, their introductions have nice histories of how U.S. subsidized wheat exports led to restructuring of how the Egyptian and Jordanian governments managed wheat supplies in the country. There's another 1985 study on the impacts of PL 480 in Egypt, and he noted that it also required Egyptians to change their consumption practices, right? In rice-consuming areas, they now needed to consume wheat and beef that is wheat-fed. And so American food aid encouraged olive oil production indirectly by supplying wheat to Jordan, which disrupted local wheat practice or production, and by also the PL 480 also. Part of it is funding the WFP, which, as I mentioned, was responsible for planting up to 75% of Jordan's olive trees, many on lands that had previously been growing those grain crops. And so now that food crops have been replaced by olives, many farmers are looking into ways to make their olive orchards more profitable. Some have decided to switch to other crops, while others have tried things like organic certification. And the strategy has also been supported by international organizations such as NICODE, which is an NGO in Japan, and JICA, which is like the USAID equivalent in Japan. They were active in trying to use organic certification as a way to encourage rural development in Jordan. And so one might think that certified organic agriculture can address the tensions between the need to supply food globally and making it more environmentally friendly. One strategy has been investment in organic certification agriculture. However, I want to question, how well does certified organic agriculture address the tensions between a need for feeding a global population and the need to preserve environmental health? How does it work differently for different populations? So again, this is that racial capitalism dynamic. Like, who is benefiting from this particular form of rural development? From 2015 to 2017, I conducted research with organic olive oil producers in Jordan. At the time of my research, there were 9 organic farms across all of Jordan. So the idea of organic was to make these more profitable for export, because locally, organic didn't have much value in most local markets. Like, maybe if you were selling to the international supermarket chains like Carrefour or Safeway, okay, but local smaller stores weren't interested in organic. In fact, I have this, yeah, people would say, we're already organic, right? Like, this is a traditional kind of olive farm, so is this. And they'd be like, we're already doing it, you know. And what they mean is it's a rain-fed crop. They don't have money to put a lot of fertilizers in it. And so to them, that's organic. So when I said I was doing research on organic olive oil, they're like, oh, it's all organic up in the north. Like, what do you mean? And then I was like, oh, no, certification. They're like, we don't do that. But there were a few. It was, like I said, an intended effort by the Japanese to use this as a rural development strategy. And so, and this is an example of one organic farm, not from this Japanese project, but from another. And so in the beginning, this is from the Japanese project, one of the farms. In the beginning, there were the farmers who are still doing this production told me that there were 50 local farmers in the region who signed up for these trainings. And to this day, only 4 families are still doing it. And so, but meanwhile, other farms have become certified, but they're mostly investment farms, right? So those farms are run by agricultural engineers, and I outlined that in that article that I kind of promoted there, where I kind of outline these differences between the smallholder farms and the investment farms. And the challenges that this presented were that by doing organic certification, like I said, where you don't have a local market of people interested in certified organic, it forced these smallholder farmers to try to reach consumers who weren't their traditional consumers, right? They had to all of a sudden, you know, their local people who were buying their oil before aren't going to pay that price premium that you need to make organic worth it. And I can kind of go through these slides and talk about that. This is an example of the investment farm in a desert area, so a place that requires irrigation, but this is actually a massive farm in the desert. To produce organic, you also have to produce to organic standards, which also means hand in hand with being extra virgin. I don't have time to go into the nuances of what extra virginity means, but that's a great Q&A if anyone is interested, and I love to talk about it. But so traditionally, you take your olives to the mill like this in these sacks, but if you want extra virgin quality and certainly organic, you have to take them in these crates so that the olives aren't compressed and they will be milled as soon as possible. You also have to have the funds to have the oil stored in a place that's airtight, temperature controlled. So these stainless steel containers are at some of the biggest organic producers. And so that's also another difference between the smallholders and the investment farmers. The investment farmers either also have a farm and the mill, right? So then they're milling and putting it in containers like this. They have the capital kind of invest in this technology, and they already have some of it. Whereas the smallholders are kind of beholden to an organic certified mill that they have to then work with and negotiate prices. So when I was doing interviews with the farmers, I did interviews with the farmers who are still doing organic, and also with the people, some of those 50 who had left doing organic, to see why they left the program or stopped doing organic. One said, okay, Plus, when I do it organically, this is someone who left, who stopped doing it, I'm asked to harvest in September and October, which is earlier in the season than most people pick. He says, do you know what that means? Less oil yield. I'm losing oil yield and they're not compensating me financially. Why would I want to keep working for them? So he's kind of part of those relationships with the mill, and picking earlier is supposed to increase the quality of the olive oil, but he was saying that you get less yield. And, there's debate around this. You can time it and for the happy medium. But in the end, he's frustrated with how he has to negotiate these things with the mill, right? That's what this quote shows us. And how it's tied with producing olive oil of a different quality than what's demanded on the local market. And then also these certifications cost a lot of money. Usually you want multiple certifications because you want to be able to export wherever. So you need an EU certification, you need a US certification. And so those smallholder farmers are also beholden to the mill they were working with because they were paying for all those certification costs. And then you also have the time cost of logging everything. And you have to keep your organic equipment separate from your non-organic equipment. And if you have non-organic crops, you have to have a buffer so that the wind doesn't blow and contaminate your organic crops. And so there's a lot of things that make it time consuming for smallholder farmers. So you think about someone who's working other jobs and also doing this versus someone at the investment farm who's an agriculture engineer and is getting paid to do all this tedious paperwork and all these, practices to meet certification. This is typically what it looks like where you get olive oil from a mill, whereas this is, I think, Safeway organic corner, right? So you can see the difference and kind of what that looks like. This is how people often store their olive oil or buy it in Jordan on the local market. This is what it looks like to produce organic. But there is this long history of olive oil production there. And so farmers who left the organic program also said it was successful producing organic and extra virgin olive oil. It was all successful, but follow-up was not maintained. It's not like in the West where when they start a project, they go all the way. No, here we reached midway and stopped. And another farmer who had also left said, they came and helped us develop something that their market needed, meaning Japan. And then they left us with a gap with no means of communication with that market. Who's going to fill this gap? The French, Italian, Japanese came and left. Then what? This is the disadvantage faced by us farmers. And a lot of the farmers, when I was talking with them, were like, yeah, we liked the organic trainings. That was great. Some of it we're already doing. Some of it was new and useful. But really, we want marketing training. We want marketing. And they said they kept telling the trainers this, but that didn't happen because it didn't match up with how the development agency was seeing who should be responsible for what part of this production. And so, meanwhile, there were also discourses in the expert olive oil field about the backwardness of rural producers. So there's this dichotomy between seeing rural smallholder farmers as backwards and stuck in their ways. Some people were like, their heads are like rocks, right? You can't teach, kind of like you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Whereas the investment farmers were seen as being interested in these new technologies. And so this kind of that racial capitalism, again, of seeing how people are just seen based on the place they're from, as being either viable for this type of production, the organic, or not. And so within this context, that although development agencies envision using organic to support rural livelihoods, organic agriculture reinforced capitalist logics about what type of production is good and who is capable of doing it. And these are common arguments about agriculture, certified organic agriculture by prominent scholars, talking about how although it's a good idea in terms of being conscious of the environment, it can also support intensive agriculture, often monocropping, and therefore sometimes prioritizes making the most profit over the environmental impacts. And there's other forms of agriculture that could be useful strategies like permaculture or agroecology, but those can also be co-opted as a basically marketing strategy. And so the production of olives should be seen in the historical context of olive tree planting in Jordan, supported through a joint program between the WFP and the Ministry of Agriculture that I mentioned. Olives were seen as a more profitable crop than wheat, but wheat is a more affordable food source, and olive production comes with different risks. So this change to the food system doesn't come without its downsides. If you have 1 year of a bad wheat crop, you can plant again the next season. If you mess up your trees with a bad frost and you have to cut off branches, it's going to take a lot longer to bounce back from that. So that's a downside of the more profitable olive trees. One farmer told me that someone at the Ministry of Agriculture said to him that the goal of this project of using organic olive oil as a rural development strategy was to get Jordanian olive oil on shelves in Japan. Right? He was like, they're not actually focused about my interest. It's viewed in a different, with different goals in mind, as a national development strategy, not a local development strategy for individual farmers in my area to improve our livelihoods. And so in this project, sponsored by Japanese development agencies, organic olive oil production was intended to benefit smallholder farmers. And I described this as the Jordanian organic paradox in my previous article, how certification actually makes it more difficult for smallholder farmers to gain more profit for their oil. In my previous writing, I've discussed this in terms of rents, but I think, as I've mentioned here, you can also think about this in terms of racial capitalism, the way in which rural farmers are not seen as productive, their knowledge is devalued, and technological innovations are emphasized over rural practices. And so to conclude, again, the point is not to demonize these projects, whether it's Svalbard or the organic olive oil production. They all have great potential, and they often do have positive impacts for communities. It's not to cast the World Food Program as being negative or only thinking about this in simplistic terms, right? A lot of the FAO website is talking about dynamic conservation of agricultural heritage. So programs are taking into account these social and cultural practices of food production. But I think we still need to continue doing research into how any initiative, even if seemingly inclusive, even if seemingly neutral, can still be affected by racial capitalism. For it is the erasure of race by saying, we're neutral, all-inclusive, and that allows it to persist in institutions and movements. Too often being inclusive is done via checkboxes without a further question of how, as Paley says, the white gaze still persists these racial logics. And so Jordan isn't typically a place where famine is a concern, right? However, it has been touched by the legacies of these famine logic-driven projects, such as the Green Revolution and PL 480, Food for Peace. Furthermore, its location in Southwest Asia and its large percentage of arid land creates an environment in which the country is continuously discussed in terms of impending crisis. Dowdy, which you saw her book earlier, The Origins of the Syrian Conflict, she argues that climate change is a background factor that amplifies the impact of ideology and unsustainable water and agricultural policies, end quote. And so she's saying, again, kind of like DeWalt, at the end, this is political, this is economic. And it seems like a subtle shift, but it completely refocuses who takes the blame for disasters and what the potential solutions can be. Other scholars who work in the region, for example, have shown how water scarcity is not a simple physical fact, but a political discourse that is implemented in order to benefit particular interests, and that's coming from Jessica Barnes's work. In other words, it's not that low precipitation is a lie or that it doesn't cause problems for farmers, but to premise that as the central reason for water scarcity ignores how governments manage water and how the decisions that they make benefit particular groups of people. There are so many ways to evaluate food systems by discussing famine risk, malnutrition, hunger, food sufficiency, food security, food availability, food access, or food sovereignty. Which concepts governments and organizations use and think about shapes this food policy. Due to much of Jordan being arid, food self-sufficiency is often written off. Right? And so when Jordan is viewed primarily under a notion of water security, it shifts the development strategy from food production for local consumption to these projects more about food production for profit. However, due to racial capitalism, a focus on profitability often does not lead to food sovereignty, and it benefits particular populations over others. And so when we look at who is driving current efforts to produce wheat, which is now having, like I mentioned before, self-sufficiency is becoming more of a concern. ICARDA, which is one of the CGIR banks, has a large role to play in Jordan in developing future initiatives to see if Jordan can restore some of its wheat production. And that's not bad. That's not a bad initiative. But judging from our overview of Svalbard and this history within the Green Revolution and racial capitalism, perhaps these programs could be improved by challenging some of our other notions about what agriculture should be done and what it looks like. Thank you, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Cook, for giving us a lot to think about. It's a whole different paradigm, at least for me, and maybe for others in the crowd too. Thank you. You can text your questions to 616-308-6560. Those online can do it in the chat box. We've got a microphone here we can pass if you've got a question. Got one over here, but I want to ask you about Jordan because you used that as your example. So the shift from more wheat production to olive production. What has it meant for the people of Jordan? Do they have less food access? Are they a hungrier people? Is there access to the things that they need? Or has this just upended all of that?
I don't think it's that dramatic. And part of my next research project is kind of I want to look at regional variability about how that shift actually took place. But I think as I mentioned in Jose Ciro Martinez's book, it changed the food system, right? And wheat is important for bread subsidies in Jordan. And I think it just created a relationship and a dependence on imported wheat. And luckily in Jordan right now, they aren't as affected as some other countries with the Ukraine-Russia crisis, right? They get a lot of their wheat from Romania, whereas like Lebanon, who gets most of their wheat from Russia and Ukraine, are having to work with the IMF and World Bank to take out loans to supply their food. And in addition to the explosion that happened several years ago and damaged their wheat supplies. But Jordan isn't facing a big crisis, but it definitely kind of made Jordan more dependent on imports, and that U.S. program did have an effect.
You mentioned geopolitical food policy, and especially with wheat. How is that affecting local dietary policy and the health of people in areas that don't normally have wheat?
Yeah, I mean, so there is, like I said, there is a long history of wheat production in Jordan. And so this is a difference between looking at this in Egypt, for example, where there was more rice production. But still in Jordan that was producing wheat, the wheat that's imported is a different variety. And the subsidized wheat that is used for the bread, a lot of people talk about it being not as nutritious, not as rich in protein, and it kind of decreased the diversity of wheat varietals that were used in bread. It also changed bread production practices, which again, that book is fabulous for kind of tracing that. But this past summer I went and I interviewed someone at a wheat mill that's been around for a long time, and they talked about the changes in demand and bread practices. Before, they said a lot more people would have been making bread at home from these local wheats, and each town had their own wheat mill, and that has kind of died off because you can buy super cheap subsidized bread at the bakery.
We have a question from our virtual audience, and maybe you could share again when you're talking about the seed vaults. Who owns the patents or rights to the seeds in the vault? And this doesn't sound like individuals really have access to this, or is disconnected from some of the concerns they have.
Yeah, so I mean, Svalbard, the seed vault specifically, is a backup depository for existing gene banks. So each gene bank might negotiate who has access to the materials, but Svalbard is made to be a backup for existing gene banks around the world. So the only person who can access that material is the person who deposited it. So I can't go to Svalbard and be like, I really want to see wheat variety number 253, from Syria. No, you can't do that. You would have to work through ICARDA, who owns that wheat variety and that plant material at their gene bank to kind of find out. And like the gene bank and ICARDA's gene bank, they work with the Ministry of Agriculture in Jordan to distribute improved wheat varieties to different regions of Jordan. That's something I'm also working on in a new project and looking at who is being benefited in those projects.
That brings up kind of a follow-up question. When you have interviewed smallholder farmers, what do they suggest would be helpful in helping them just, not just economically, but also, being better farmers?
Yeah, in the case of olive oil, I mean, one of the, like I mentioned before, the marketing was the big thing in terms of that Japanese program. They were really frustrated that they didn't get the marketing experience, so then they were reliant long-term on the mill, and they weren't able to access the people who would be interested in buying organic certified oil. And they had mentioned that they had tried in the past to kind of gather funds to run a mill kind of as a cooperative, but the project didn't follow through, because that's a really capital heavy investment to make for a large group of people. And then I have another quote in there that I didn't say. Some farmers were frustrated with the Ministry of Agriculture, feeling like the Ministry of Agriculture was more interested in supporting people who had large farms and giving them all the support. Oh, you have a pest, let us come out and test it and see how we can help. And the smallholders being like, I wish, I had that support from the ministry.
We've got another text question. They're asking, okay, so what is extra virgin olive oil?
It took my bait. So extra virgin olive oil is evaluated by two things, a chemical analysis and a sensory analysis. So the chemical analysis, the two main components are fatty acids, have to be below 0.8, I believe, and peroxide levels, and then have to be a certain amount. And then if it passes that chemical analysis, it also has to pass a sensory analysis. There's actually you get trained to taste olive oil. There is an International Olive Council that will send you, if you want to be trained to be an olive oil taster, they will send a box of olive oil samples, both of the bad things you're supposed to look out for in olive oil, so you can calibrate your palate, right? And then just you kind of have like a test, and they send these samples where they've had their experts mark what defects are there and what positive attributes, and you're tested to see if you come up with the same scoring for the olive oil. So you have to be free of defects and then have positive aspects such as fruity flavor, of apple or whatever it is.
I have a question. You talked about self-sufficiency versus have you developed an opinion as to should a country be seeking agricultural self-sufficiency? And who would you identify as someone who's writing about that right now in a way that's helpful?
That's a great question, and thank you, because that's something in my conclusion I didn't touch on that I had in there. So I don't think self-sufficiency is necessarily a goal that every country can obtain or should, right? Jordan has had major population influx from refugees from Palestine, from Iraq, from Syria. And although and again, it's this, what are the causes? They often get blamed for the food pressures in the country and infrastructural pressures, and then kind of as a scapegoat instead of blaming larger policies in the country. But I think food self-sufficiency might not be a reality for Jordan, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't also invest in local food production instead of focusing more on profit crops, right, and exports. And so there's a really great program right now. There's an NGO that is trying to or support new wheat production in Amman, like in the main city in Jordan, by helping to find people who own plots of land that are empty and allowing this organization to come plant on that land and harvest it for local wheat production. And they're planting local varieties that aren't planted as often anymore. So that's a really neat project, kind of thinking about self-sufficiency, right? Trying to not fully stop imports and be truly self-sufficient, but to increase self-sufficiency, right? So thinking about it as a spectrum and not this black and white. We need to be fully self-sufficient. And I think that's where it's important to think through these nuances and not writing Jordan off as this arid, unsustainable space, but thinking about ways that we can increase self-sufficiency but not have it be the end goal. Does that make sense? There's also a great program in Palestine, McKinney out of Birzeit University. Omar Testel and his students have been working on improved varieties, but also doing really heavy work on looking at the social history of these different crops and thinking about them in terms of climate change, but really doing important ethnographic research on the cultural implantedness of these plants as well.
We do have an in-person audience question, but this next question virtually fits into this. We had a viewer talk about El Nino for 2024 being, a big event, and thinking about how whether your research considers when analyzing the effectiveness of the varieties food programs and how the seed vault may plan for the future. In other words, maybe are we looking for things that have seeds that have specific growing conditions, or something that could be highly adaptable based on what might come in the future?
I think it's both, right? And Carrie Fowler in the book, talks really nicely about this of like, we can't predict the future, right? And so by preserving biodiversity, it's kind of, I called it an insurance plan kind of tongue in cheek, but really like, how can we cover our bases for whatever the future holds? And so again, I'm not denigrating biodiversity work. I think it's great, but just saying, okay, how does this shape rural livelihoods for folks? But no, I think it's both of those things.
Thank you so much for a fantastic presentation, Brittany. My question is, if you encounter spaces outside of racial logics or logics outside of this dominant way of thinking and doing among the people you interview, and what that is, what's their agency, what's their proposal?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, that's a great question. The flip side of like talking about it through race is it kind of promotes this, not dichotomy, but maybe generalizes a little bit too much. Not everyone is disparaging against rural farmers. And there are projects like the McKinney project that I mentioned in Palestine that are really engaging with rural knowledge and sitting with people in the community and gaining their knowledge, doing oral history work, that kind of thing. And so I don't think it's always this dichotomy of like modernization and improvement and rural folks as backwards. And so there are instances in which those lines are blurred and it doesn't fall along. But it's still noticeably present how those discourses flow through these development spaces, I think, right? So it's not a clear map of the reality, but these discourses do work, and I think that's where it's important to like call them out.
We probably have time for just one last question. So another text question, how do we keep these seeds safe in the vault? I mean, it's pretty high tech, I would expect. So maybe you could talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, so that's why Svalbard was chosen as a location, because it's the northernmost inhabited place on the planet. It's cold, and it's in a country that doesn't face much conflict, right? And so that is the security policy, that this facility has cold temperatures so that it needs less work to keep it cold to preserve the seeds. It's in a politically stable place, and a place where you don't have to worry about too many natural hazards, and it's kind of out of the way. So
Let's thank Dr. Cook again for a great evening. Thank you so much. Thank you for being with us. Learned a lot. Thanks for being with us tonight. We will be back 1 week from today, same time, 6 o'clock, right here in this auditorium. Suzanne DiMaggio is coming from the Carnegie Institute for International Peace, and we're going to shift our gaze to Iran. There's so much going on in that country. It's been in the news so much. Iran at a crossroads will be the theme of her talk. So we'll see you next week. Take good care.